the stair treads, and it was kind of dimly lit because it was very early in the morning. And I started to read it, and it was addressed to John.
A terrifying message scrawled across 3 pages.
It said, "We have your daughter."
A lot of things didn't make sense. Why would they leave a ransom note with her body still in the house?
My first impression was that this guy wrote the Magna Carta.
You will withdraw $118,000 from your account.
If I were kidnapping this guy's daughter, I'd ask for $250,000, $500,000, $1 million. So the amount of money is just really odd to me.
This ransom note from the beginning has been baffling, but I think most people agree it's connected to the killer. And probably, I mean, if it's not the killer, then who would have written this, right? Like, why would you write that note? But it wasn't even a kidnapping, it was a murder. She was still in the house. So take a look at the ransom note. This is, you know, one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case, and yet they haven't been able to connect anyone to it. So we've got Gary Oliva confessing in a letter and writing tons of letters to Michael Vale. So what we want to do is compare Gary Oliva's letter to the ransom note to say, hey, are there consistencies here? Does it look like the same person could have or did write these 2 letters? But I'm going to go right to the experts, if you don't mind, who you helped put all this together. So I want to take a look at sort of like a layover kind of comparison that Moselle did. We have something we could put on the screen here, which compares the TH, the IF, the U, and some of the words here. Moselle, why don't you begin to explain this and what it tells you?
Well, for me, it's really about the nuances, the little things that are not common. It's important to look at the common similarities as well, but it's also important to look at the uncommon things. For example, a lot of the people who are at home armchair sleuths, you know, they will look at it and say, oh, well, it doesn't visually look the same. But if you can, you know, everybody kind of learned the same way in school to a certain extent, and so there's going to be some commonalities. So when you overlay them, though, some of these weird little strokes that are awkward, that are not common, like a little bend in the T stem or an arch in the H, those are unique to that individual. So when you overlay them, they line up so well. That's a really loud announcement in my profession.
Okay, Dawn, let's start going through some of the letters now. Let's start.
Sure. So when you look at these, you might think at first, oh, these don't look the same. One starts and one's, you know, on a upward slant to curve over. However, if you lay these 2 over, if you take the blue A and you lay it over the black A, it almost lines up in that arch that bends around. You can see how they line up a little bit. And then there's also an indentation on that right-hand side, which I think is on another slide later, that you can see in the same location on both sides, both documents. It's easy to spot things that are similar, but what we're really looking for is those things that aren't really obvious, but we can still find. So that's what we're looking for beyond that. What else is in that writing that is unique to both documents?
So let's go through some more letters. Go through the letter C now. Let's take a look. Moselle, what are your thoughts about the C's?
Well, it's very interesting because the C's and the E's, if you just looked at those letters of Gary's, a lot of them resemble an E. But we have to look at, you know, we have 2 different writing instruments. We have a Sharpie and we have an ink pen. So when you're comparing them, you're automatically going to have some residual stroking of the Sharpie, because it does automatically bleed into the paper weave a lot differently than the ink would sit on it. However, you can still see when you overlay them the same strokes, the angles, the hooks, the exits, they are still there, even though we have different writing instruments.
Let's go to the D's.
What's significant about these Ds, if you look how they're both written on each side, they start at the top. And now at the top on the question document, you see that black dot. That's because it's a Sharpie pen, and that ink is flowing as soon as it makes contact with the paper. So both these Ds start at the top and they go all the way around. Both, again, exist in both documents.
Moselle, we have here two L's together. Let's take a look at that and tell me what you think.
The L's, I was so excited when I saw the L's because it just has so much difference in the visual aspect of it. But when we overlay them, there's just no denying that they are made with the same stroke. It has the same, the same bend in the stems. It has the same spacing between the stems that also line up. So they are very distinct.
So when you look at these M's, you're going to say that they don't look alike. That these ones are shorter in the middle, where that you have the peaks and the valleys. But when you overlay them, you can still see that the spacing is the same, and that's what we look for also. So obviously, the ransom note is disguised writing, so it's not going to look exactly the same. However, when you lay these over, you can see how they do line up as far as the spacing goes.
What are you seeing here?
So for me, one of the big things I always look for when I'm analyzing a question document is I am looking for entrance and exit strokes. Where do they start? Where do they end? How do they meet and connect? And after they complete, what shape are they? So when we overlay these, it's just, again, again, it's just, how do you deny this?
Glance, you're going to look at the 1997 and you're going to see some wobbliness and some heavier ink at the bottom, the base of the 9, but you have to remember that that is written with a Sharpie pen, so you're going to see more of that than you may have if it was written with a ballpoint pen. So when you look at the 9s on the right and you lay those over the 9s in the middle, sort of, and I think we do have an overlay on this one, I'm not sure if it's going to play, but those 9s line up, they're just a little bit shorter. And then the double 9s also line up. So that the .99 on the right side of the known sample is actually the 99-cents piece of the 1999. And it still lines up in over these other 99s to where they're centered and still within the same spacing, more or less. And then the 7, of course, that top bar across the top is nearly the same length. And then both of them come down almost straight before the blue 7 bends a little bit and before the 7 gets a little wobbly. But you can still, when those are overlaid, they're pretty similar.
Okay, so let's get to the bottom line here now. So, Moselle, I'll begin with you. I'm not familiar. What's the standard when you compare? Is it like more likely than not inconsistent with, or what's your conclusion?
So for me, I use a 5-point scale, which basically 5 would say, absolutely, there's no way possible this person could have written this, in my opinion. Again, this is just my opinion. So for this, I would be at about a 1.75. I would love to have seen more handwriting, but we can only work with what we have access to. But based on everything that I looked for and looked at, I had dozens and dozens of samples of Gary's. I started at 250, went up to 225, then was at a 2, and then ended at 175.
So what does 175 mean again?
Means pretty close to certain, but you can never say 100%.
Right. So it's very close. Okay. So Dawn,
very close.
What was your conclusion?
So I started out more at a 3-4 in the very beginning because I didn't do the deep dive. I was still just did a peer review. And the more I started digging into it, the more I started doing the overlays, I could see more significance in the similarities. And it's a compelling argument that there's a lot of anomalies in here. And so I did manage to get down to, and I was on a 2 for a little while, but those O's and some of the numbers, the A's that have a little indentation that exists in both documents, they were a little convincing. So I'm between a 1.75 and a 2. So in my opinion, it's plausible.
Wow. Fascinating stuff. I appreciate you coming on and sharing that with us. Pretty amazing. So